who is from the University of Wisconsin La Crosse, just talking to Carl about how I went to the University of Texas for an undergrad, and that's where he did his PhD with Jack Daniels. And he just, not only is Dr. Foster, this is one of those things, kind of check a box, for your career to be able to introduce someone like Dr. Foster. But you look at the people that he trained with, and you're checking lots of boxes in terms of some of the major players over the years in our field. So it's a great honor to introduce you, and I'm not going to take any more of your time. Monitoring exercise training is the topic, the subtopic, the past, the present, and the future.
Thank you very much, Gary. I guess you guys are the survivors, or else the people with nothing, with no social life, nothing to do. If you think about monitoring training, you have to think about a commercial that's on television now, where the bank robbers are coming in the bank and they're smashing things, and there's this guy in this little uniform that looks like a security guard, and all the customers are laying on the floor in terror and looking up to him, and he's saying, well, I'm not a security guard, I'm a security monitor. I just tell people if there's a problem. There's a problem. And then the tagline is, why monitor something if you're not going to do anything about it? And so that's the whole thing, is you can add stuff up, but you got to have some way to do something about it. And so I'll talk later about physicians and coaches actually being the same person, but let's start this at the perspective of being a coach. The coach has to know if their athlete is making progress. I mean, that's what the coach's job is to help them get better, and they want to know if they're on the right path. Well, you can figure that out on the training track if you're smart, but in winter sports, sometimes it's really hard. And in summer sports, it can be. So you go to the laboratory and use all this sexy stuff that we know how to use. And supposedly that's better. If you believe that, then you probably need to go back to school. But if you ask about this kind of stuff, ask what are we really good at in terms of monitoring stuff. We can pretty well tell you if somebody's a hopeless case. Some runner comes in and is really keen, and you measure them and their VO2 is 64. They're probably not going to go to the Olympics. Maybe they would, but I put money against it. So we're pretty good at doing that. If somebody's not doing good, theoretically, we could bring an athlete in that we do something about and remeasure them and see if things are going forward in a good way. To some degree, you can look at individual responses to training, but all of this stuff you can do in the field as well. This is Eric Heiden, who I worked with speed skaters for a lot of years. And Eric was the best there ever was or ever will be. He went to the Olympics, and every medal they offered, he got the gold one. If they'd offered more medals, he would have gotten more gold medals. It was that good. The problem is everybody was trying to do Heiden training. They figured, well, if Eric did this, then it must be right. Well, only one problem is they're not Eric, and Eric's just a unique guy. And so supposedly you can measure progress, but I'm not sure we're all that good at it. And remember that all of the things that we know how to measure are really just surrogates, and the important stuff is how fast can you go. I mean, that's really what you want to know. And then the one thing we're probably really are good at is looking in standard conditions. Now, when I first started working with speed skating, it was an outdoor sport, so the ice is different day to day, the weather's different day to day. Workout numbers are hard to compare day to day because everything changes. Calgary, I hate to say it to the folks at Salt Lake City, which is the best American oval, but if you gave me the chance to go skate, I'd go to Calgary. It's a nicer oval, and it's always Calgary in the lab. I can create standard conditions, therefore I can see things. But the most important thing is to let coaches look in the athlete's eyes at full effort. Think about it. If you're training a runner or a swimmer or a cyclist or a speed skater, they're going by at some unbelievable speed. You can't really look in their souls and see what's going on. And the coach needs to understand that. This girl's named Michelle Klein. She was a 1992 Olympian. Very talented, probably did not achieve her physical potential. And one of the things that taught us this, we were in the basement of the University of Calgary. The kids had just come back from Europe. They were really, really tired. I missed that they were in trouble, which is a whole nother story. I'm over there in the back with another athlete. She got midway through a 10K time trial and said, oh, I can't do this. And the coach was actually the one taking the picture. And I, in the moment, sort of yelled at her and said, you don't ever quit in a time trial. Because you don't quit in a competitive effort. And it was just a spontaneous thing, but it was the right thing to say in the moment. And the coach just looked at me and shook his head, and he understood something about coaching her. And she went on to be better after this because he changed his coaching approach. Well, it had nothing to do with the data. We weren't measuring VO2. We weren't getting lactates and heart rates. But the advantage here, the thing that was good, was the coach's eyes right there when she's at full effort. And then what are we less good at? The problem is the coach needs to make decisions frequently. Is the program going good? Do I change something? You don't do that once every 3 months. You do that every single day. But if you're going to come to the lab, you got to organize the lab. You got to have the athletes in on a schedule. You got to organize the athletes' training so that they're ready to be tested and everything is standard. Folks, we are horrible at doing that. Likewise, the coach needs results now. He can't wait for 3 months for us to download everything and put it in PowerPoint and do statistics on it. He's got to make a decision now. And we are horrible at that. And then the other thing is, I've never had a coach not say to me, you know, my athletes are missing training by coming in to do this. I don't think they really are, but the coaches think they are, and that's what the important thing is, because if you're going to do any good, you got to freshen them up for a couple of days, which means you got to change your training program. You're not doing exactly what looks like a workout to the coach. And so even though they're exercising and getting a lot of activity, the coach really doesn't think. So they think they're missing training. If they think they're missing training, how long are they going to come to you? It ain't a very long period of time, folks. And so we're not very good at that. So you say, why monitor training? Because it takes too long for the results to emerge. You'd like to see how are things going. And this also is a mindset kind of thing. The coach, the trainer, the therapist, and the physician are exactly the same person. They're all doing diagnostics. What's wrong? Why can't Carl run a 4-minute mile? My coach used to ask that, so my coach had to figure out Carl's got no talent. But he had to come up with something a little more esoteric. How do I make this better? He would change the way the training program was designed. I go to my physician, why does Carl cough all the time? I have chronic bronchitis. And so my doctor has to make a diagnosis, and then he gets medicines or whatever he's doing to try to make me better. The functions here are exactly the same. You're just in different protoplasms. These people get Olympic goals or Super Bowl rings. These people, you try to keep them alive and keep them comfortable. If you're working in cardiac rehab, why can't the patient do activities of daily living? You may not do a diagnostic test, but you do little diagnostics to say what's their exercise capacity. And then you design a program, a diet, exercise, whatever, to try to make it better. And so they need to know if the plan they have is being executed. Because to some degree, if you do what the physician says, 99% of the time you get better. If you do what the coach says, 99% of the time you get better. I'll show you later, athletes do not do what coaches tell them to do. That's why they fail. It's really simple. The nice news, and it's important, is all of them are visual learners. So they're pretty easy to draw pictures and let them see stuff. Now you also got to think, if you're thinking about training, the biology of training is really simple. Stuart Phillips, was that yesterday? He was talking about all this nice molecular stuff, which is right at the limit of my understanding. But everything in biology that involves exercise is you got to grow new proteins. You grow more contractile proteins and you get stronger. Your mitochondrial proteins increase, your endurance gets better. And so you do an exercise bout, you create some sort of disturbance, which we call signaling, and we know signaling cascades are impossibly complicated, but you come up with a couple of terminal signaling molecules that sort of tells you what you want to do. That gets into the nucleus where you transcribe the right part of the code to make the protein so you can make the homeostatic disturbance go away. That gets back out into the cytoplasm and gets translated into new protein. I get enough new protein and I get better. Is the training program going to do that? Now, I'm not going to measure protein synthesis. That takes forever. But I can measure results, and that's the same sort of thing. But to monitor training, you need standard conditions. This is Arne Andersson and Gunnar Haag, who were Swedish runners who 5 times in the 1940s broke the world record in the mile. Sweden was neutral during the Second World War, so athletics did not come to a screeching halt. If they weren't racing each other, they would have gotten the 4-minute mile, but they were all the time trying to beat each other. This is a picture of one of the races, but look at the track in the background. It's a cinder track, and if you're old enough to have run on a cinder track, you know a good cinder track is good, but they chew up very easily. And if you get a climate like Sweden where it's sort of a harsh climate, it's hard to have standard conditions. So if you're doing a workout on this, what's the track different from day to day? I mean, it's impossible. If you go to Norway or Sweden or someplace, or Wisconsin, and you try to ski, snow is different every day. Temperature, snow quality, glide qualities. So how do you monitor training? And then, of course, the Swedes have a way for it. This is Gunnar Haag, and he's out winter training in Sweden in the 1940s. How do you know if this workout's better than yesterday's? It's a faster kilometer than they've done, but they don't know anything about it. And so as people came along, coaches sort of adopted this idea that, well, maybe we ought to have index workouts. And in the late 1930s, when interval training sort of emerged, this idea emerged. The real champion coaches that made this happen were Franz Steinfeld, and he was all over the place, and then but Bill Bowerman here in Oregon. This is a prototypical or a theoretic sort of thing that I've culled out of the literature, trying to describe Roger Bannister's approach to setting the first 4-minute mile. Now, Roger was a physician. He was working as a house officer, so he had about an hour a day that he was free. So he'd come out of the hospital, take off his white coat, get on the bus, go a few minutes across town to the track, put on his track suit, and he only had about 30 minutes to work out. And so they did all intervals all the time. One of his favorite intervals was to do 10 times 400 on a 3-minute send-off. And then in the fall, he would start around 66 seconds. And then the idea is you would get faster and faster and faster as this went along. Now remember, this is England on a cinder track in the 1950s. The conditions are unbelievably harsh. England's a wet, windy, cold climate in the winter, so making good decisions here is hard, but they did it, and he kept progressing. So they had index workouts they did. And then Franz Steinfeld, because he's a genius, saw about April, Bannister and his buddies that he was running with just stagnated. They couldn't bring their times down anymore. They didn't have a word for overtraining syndrome in those days. Franz said, God, your guys are not going good. Hey, little boys, get on the bus, go over to Wales, and hike for a week. Don't take your track shoes. Don't do anything. Just go hike for a week and have some fun. Get away from me. They come back. Immediately their times come down. Rule of thumb in track and field is whatever you can average for this workout, you can run a mile in. Well, he got down to here. He broke the 4-minute mile in May. And Bill Bowerman used to have a concept of date pace. How fast do I want you for a date? And what goal pace do I want you at the end of the year? And that was a genius that's still at the University of Oregon. This worked for me too it works for untalented runners. I was a guy with a lot more ambition than physical talent. 1967, I could do this workout and I could average 68 seconds, which is a 4:32 pace. My best mile was 4:34. It works for the bad and it works for the good. And I had no idea what my heart rate was. I didn't even know what the word lactate meant. So this stuff works at the simplest levels. And then the science guys came along, us, and we sort of complicated it. This is Matty Carvonen, who in the 1950s came up with the idea of heart rate reserve and that there was a minimal threshold you had to train at. Wilbur Holman, Winnie Kinderman, Carmen Wasserman, Bengt Saltine, I could put 100 people on this thing of the scientists that have contributed to stuff to try to figure out what coaches are really already known, but to do it in a systematic way. And then to tell coaches, oh yeah, this is why they're going good. And the coach says, yeah, right. And so then we came along, this is 1939, this is Waldemar Gershler and Heinrich Reindel, who really invented interval training in Freiburg, Germany. And they come up with the idea you're supposed to run to 180, recover to 120. I mean, that's still sort of a phrase you hear periodically. Where did they come up with that? It got pulled out of somebody's place where the sun don't shine, folks. It's probably not bad advice, but there's no physiologic base for it. And look how they're doing their physiology on a supine bicycle ergometer with an elite runner. What are you going to learn in supine bicycle ergometer with an elite runner? I do not know. And then sometime later, we came up with the idea of thresholds. So Bill Holman probably was ahead of Carmen Wasserman, but they both in the early 60s understood that. Bertil Sjödin, coming out of Stockholm, was the one that made us believe that Obla and runs at 4 millimoles were somehow magic. So this group of people all told us that, well, we can measure something, and there's some importance to it, and if we can measure it, we can measure it sequentially so we can monitor it. Then we get heart rate monitors, and we get lactate analyzers, and this is the most brilliant ad I've ever seen. If you have your own lactate analyzer, you don't need a coach. Anybody stupid enough to really believe that? I did. And then the problem is Holman and Sjödin and all these people were coming up with the idea that there must be some single optimal intensity of training. You know, if I want to run a mile in 4 minutes, I wanted to, but I didn't get within a half minute of it. I could run 100 meters a day as fast as I could. I could run 3 hours a day and just try to survive it. But probably neither one of those are going to get me to a 4-minute mile, but there's probably something in the middle that's going to do the best job of any one thing. And they convinced us that it's 4 millimoles, Obla. And so in the mid-80s, everybody was finding thresholds and saying, here's your magic intensity, go do it. Turns out it doesn't work so well that way. So we still have the lactate profile as a standard technique when you bring your group of athletes in. You put them on the bike in the laboratory, you can do it out in the field. You make it harder and harder, you measure heart rate, you measure blood lactate. You find first and second thresholds and you associate heart rates with them. And you can look at your heart rate monitor and say, ooh, I'm going too fast, I better slow down. That's still a dominant model in terms of what we do. You can do the same thing with power meters. We have power meters on our bikes if you want to spend the money. But we get this idea that somehow there's some sort of magic training. I'm not sure there is. Then it got really complicated, and the first really rational thinking about this occurred here in the Pacific Northwest. Eric Bannister up at Simon Fraser came up with the idea of the TRIMS. And what he basically did was say, okay, you can measure training intensity and duration together using heart rate because he had heart rate monitors. You can combine that into a single number. You can measure training over a period of time. And one of the realities is that if you train harder, you get fitter and fitter and fitter and fitter. And then when you train easier, you get less fit. But at the same time you're getting fitter, you're also getting tireder. So fatigue is accumulating. And then when you reduce your training, fatigue goes away more quickly than fitness does. So you get a peak where you're going to run your best. And he showed it for several people. Actually, he showed it for the guys who worked in the laboratory, all of whom were co-authors on their papers. And so the mathematics are completely elegant. The first time I saw Morton and Fitzclark's papers, I hit myself in the head and said, wow, this is brilliant. But the mathematics were way over my head. I'm not very good with when you start putting exponents together. And so I thought, okay, they've got the right idea. They understand the conceptual part of training, the balance between fitness and fatigue. You can make arguments about what their exponents are and how they measure it, but that's okay. But the bad news about Eric, and I considered him a good friend when he was alive, and we would have these long conversations at ACSM, Eric was the most obtuse human being I've ever met in my life. Well, actually, there's a guy named Motter at the University of Cologne who is close to matches him, but he would get off into flights of academic fancy that you would not believe. And it was hard to explain to a coach what he was talking about. I said, this is the most brilliant stuff I've ever heard, but I can't even understand it. I can't keep up with it. And so one of the points of my career has been to try to make Eric Bannister understandable. Because I thought, well, this is a brilliant idea, but we just can't execute what he wants. And so I was like this guy saying, you've got to be kidding, I can't make sense of it. And then one day, in one of those great serendipitous moments that happens in your life, I was sitting in the shower room after doing a workout in exactly this posture and said, wow, that was hard. And this little light bulb went on in my head, and I thought, And I've been working with the Borg scale since way back in my career. And I said, normally we use the Borg scale and say, how do you feel now? Well, I just integrated a whole workout without doing anything else. And I said, wow, that's interesting. If that's intensity, if I multiply it by time, I've got a trend without all the stuff that Bannister had to measure. And then at the same time, my kids were playing kids soccer, and they would come home, and this is Ian, my oldest, and he was, the coach ran us and ran us and ran us. I almost threw it up. I want to quit soccer. I hate it. My other son would come home, Colin, and say, the coach just talked and talked, and the ground was cold. My butt got tired. I hate soccer. Can I take up music? He's worked as a musician for a while. And then I realized that what my kids were telling me with narrative was what was in the Borg scale. And we'd already done violence to Professor Borg's rather systematic way of doing the Borg scale by trying to make it simpler with cartoons and colors and changing the words. And I said, well, if this is right, if this is a marker of intensity, then you ought to match up to heart rate reserve. So we had a bunch of people do workouts and said, okay, how was the whole workout? And it lined up pretty good. The correlation was good. And then we did lactates because you're a physiologist, you got to measure lactate. And when their RPEs were low, most of their lactates were in the low range, below 2.5 millimoles. When their RPEs were high, most of their lactates were above 4 millimoles. So we had two objective physiologic markers to say, wow, it was hard. Tells us something about intensity, and now all I got to do is look at the clock. So I thought, wow, this is sort of neat. At the same time, other people were thinking about it. We had heart rate monitors that would do a lot of stuff, and they give us these beautiful curves. But then how do you evaluate them? And then Sally Edwards down in California, who literally wrote the heart rate monitor book when heart rate monitors first came out, started talking about, can you summate points out of her zone system, which was based only on percentages of maximal heart rate. And she and I are good friends, but all we ever do is argue when we're together. And but then we thought about it, and the problem is her zones were arbitrary, but if you set up zones based on the three thresholds, below VT, above RCT, and between them, I can say, okay, I can use this heart rate tracing and say, well, all of this, you're below your first threshold. You shouldn't get much credit for that. It's too easy. It's not very provocative. Alternatively, these minutes here are up in zone 3. You ought to get more credit for that, right? It's harder. So we just made up some exponents that turn out to load pretty well to say, okay, every minute in zone 1, you get 1 point. Every minute in zone 2, you get 2 points. And the heart rate monitor will tell you how many minutes you're in each zone. And every minute in zone 3, you get 3 points. So I can add these up and I say, this workout's an 86. So now I've got a quantitative representation of what the workout is in terms of stimulating protein growth. And I can add it up at the end of the week. So that's a good idea. The problem was I worked with speed skaters. I don't know if you know any speed skaters, but they're like Tigger. They're little bouncy people that do power stuff. The best explanation, if you understand running, it's like they're 400 meter intermediate hurdlers who are carrying somebody else on their back. In other words, it's a speed sport, it's a very technique sport, it requires endurance and it requires strength. And so if their heart rate could be 400 beats a minute, it would. but your heart rate only goes so fast. So this technique doesn't work with the athletes that I was with, so I needed something else. And we already had the session RPE, so now I've got something that's not heart rate dependent. So we thought this was neat. And at the time, we were still interested in overtraining syndrome. And nobody could figure out, except we knew that it was bad, and you don't want to get it because there's no therapy for it. And the last position stand that we wrote on it, that's still the answer, whatever. But Gerrit Brown in the Netherlands, who's a veterinarian, got interested in trotters, which are racehorses. You know, if you get overtraining syndrome, who cares? Your wife cares because she's got to listen to you. Your coach may care because of his job. Nobody else on the planet, your mother always cares, but nobody else on the planet cares. But if a racehorse gets off their feed syndrome, they don't eat right, kick their stalls, bite their handlers, and they run bad. Somebody loses a lot of money. So this was important. So Gerrit Brown and Harm Kuipers got a big horsey treadmill, and they ran horses, and they got a performance marker on them. How long could they last? And then they trained them for a while, and this is conceptual hard day, easy day. They did it for weeks, and they got better. And then they trained them harder, and they got more better. And they trained them harder, and they got more better. And you get the normal saturation curve that you expect. And then they said, you know, we just can't train these horses any harder. Let's take away the easy days. The minute they did that, the horses fell apart. It's not overtrained syndrome, it's under-recovery syndrome. We know that. And then I thought, well, we got to have a way of mathematically expressing it, because I'm a geek, I want to measure stuff. And I said, well, if I measure the average of this, I know the average training load across a week. And if I measure the standard deviation, I wanted something simple. I get a marker of the weekly mean divided by the standard deviation. And this one has got a higher mean, but the standard deviation is a lot smaller. And I called it monotony. I wanted to call it lack of variability, but I was working with a Dutch speed skating coach named Gerrit Timkers, and Dutch people can't say variability. It just doesn't come out of a Dutch mouth. So I said, okay, let's call it monotony, which unfortunately in English means boring, but it means monotony, unchanging. And so I've now got an index of how changeable the workload is. And then if I said, well, if I know the average load, the trim, and I multiply it by monotony, I get strain, which should be the bad thing that causes me, because, I mean, I can go out and do my same 40-minute exercise bout every single day, because I'm just trying to stay alive at 70 years old, and it's not very hard. But if you're training hard, you gotta have something to make this number smaller, or otherwise you get hurt or you get overtraining syndrome. So we thought, geez, this is really neat. So then we went to the lab. I don't know if Marty Hoffman's still here. He was editor at the time of the Wisconsin Medical Journal, which is not the New England Journal of Medicine, but he asked me to write an article. So I talked a bunch of speed skaters to coming to the lab and riding a 10K on my bike. And I thought that was a really neat test. And speed skaters are not very smart. I love them to death, but they're dumb. So they agreed to ride my bike, and they agreed to fill out this diary with how hard they were working. And so over several weeks, as their training went up from early season to late season, their performance times came down, which, I mean, you get better when you train, right? And so then I just went and did, let's do an arithmetic average of this curve. So that's just this average. And then I said, well, no athlete trains nothing, so let's start at 500 units a week. And if you think of ACSM, 30 minutes at moderate intensity, that's a 3 on the 10-point Borg scale. That's 90 units a day, times 7 is 450 units a week. So minimal ACSM sanctioned training. We started and we built ourselves a curve, and by sheer coincidence, a 10-fold increase in training gave them a 10% improvement in time. Wow, we didn't even cheat to do that. So we could predict the good stuff that happened with just knowing how much training they were doing. I was still worried about overtraining syndrome, so using upper respiratory infections as surrogates, I went back and looked at their load, their monotony, and their strain, and I found that in 87% of the cases, I could predict a cold because of a preceding spike in strain. And that was sort of neat. And I went and showed this to the speed skating coaches, And typically October, November are the really hard months for them because then the World Cup season starts. And what do coaches do? They say, come on kids, let's just take away the recovery days just these 2 weeks. The kids say, yeah, coach, let's do that. We're tough, we can do it. And the coach said, you know, every single athlete I had was sick that week or the next week. I said, guys, it works. So then the other thing that was happening is we still don't want to do maximal tests because I can't bring you in to run a 10K time trial and expect you to do a normal workout, and the coaches think what I'm doing in the lab is interfering with training. One day, one of the speed skaters was running by. I was just sitting out at the oval waiting to do something, and she was warming up and said, you know, my heart rate's really high. I must be getting overtrained. I thought to myself, could you fail the warm-up? So we've been working on this for several years. Back in the 70s, Paul Haber over in Austria came up with the PWC 170. But if you think about it, if you're in less good shape, your heart rate will go up faster, your PWC 170 will go down. Well, what if you're tachycardic because you're overtrained? Rob Lamberts in South Africa has attacked this in a very systematic way. I think he's a little too complicated, but the idea is there. We tried to do it experimentally, and it got way, way too complicated. Jose Rodriguez Moroyo in Spain, I think, is on the track of using RPE at a fixed workload, which you can do during warm-up. And so if you can fail the warm-up, I can go to you and say, you failed, get out of here, go take a day off. I can make day-to-day decisions in the space of your warm-up. And likewise, if you come to me and you're complaining, and I say, you passed your warm-up, quit bitching and get out there and go. So now the coach has got a tool that we think will work. We think we're on the edge of it. And so we know this stuff works. This is the data just turned on its head that you saw a minute ago. The more training, this is ACSM norms. Performance improves 10% with a tenfold increase in training. I don't have my slide in here, but when the world record was held by Jim Ryan, I was in that area as a runner. I was training about this much, but the world record was up here. Now, if I could have trained more, which I couldn't, I still would not have gotten to the world record. That's called talent. We also know if you change this to preventive medicine, and these are really recent data out of Denmark based on survival. Do you stay alive? And think about it, physicians are really good if you're alive. If you're dead, they're not so good. The more minutes you do, so this index of intensity and duration, from questionnaires, the more you do, the risk of being dead gets smaller. It reaches its nadir somewhere around 7 to 12 hours a week of walking at 3 minutes. If you're a jogger, going fairly slow, it reaches its nadir. There's this big question mark about, do the old guys who are still competing and still training hard have a little bit higher risk? There's a lot of phenomenology out there. There's a lot of curves with this tip in it, but we don't know enough to know what it means yet. But again, if we can monitor training, I can say, okay, get down to here. Then we're doing as much as we can do with exercise. Now your doctor's got other jobs. Now the other thing that goes with this, if patients take your advice, if athletes take your advice, they're going to get better. But a couple of things are important. We're working in a therapeutic window. I'm using it as intensity, but it can be frequency, it can be duration, it can be TRIMPs. We know the good things follow a saturation curve. The bad things follow an accelerating curve. Patients you keep down here because you don't want one of the side effects being dead. So you accept smaller effects to avoid the side effects. Athletes don't care, so you train them as hard as you want and hope you get lucky. But we also know, really first elucidated by Neil Ulrich in the Ontario Collaborative Heart Study, but it works with any behavioral therapy you want. You want to stop smoking, you want to change your diet, you want to go on an exercise program. At 12 months, 50% of people are still doing what they said to do. I've never seen this kind of study in an athlete, but I'll bet you dollars to donuts that if they went on a program that was coach supervised In a year, half of them would be doing something that looked like what the coach did. The other half would have made up their mind. So you say, if you've only got this problem, and we know that with people who are less engaged, the lower socioeconomic classes, the less well-educated, people that are smokers, their curves are even worse. We know you have to reward behavior, not results. That's psychology 101. You can give people advice, you can set goals, you can write a contract. I'm going to charge you $500 a month to come to my gym. If you come 99% of the time, I'll give you $200 back. It's got to have an if, it's got to be written, it's got to have an if-then statement in it. We know it works. It changes people's behavior. If you come 99% of the time, I'll give you my nice little jogger t-shirt. That works. Self-monitoring strategy. If you make people write stuff down. I know there's a lot of people now trying to do dietary stuff. They take pictures of every single thing they eat. The process of doing that changes their eating behavior. Likewise, if you're a smoker, you wrap a piece of paper around a pack of cigarettes and say, okay, smoke all you want, but every time you do, you got to say when and why. You cut their smoking behavior in half almost immediately. So simple little behavioral things. Well then, why not ask people to visually track stuff? And are patients and athletes really different? Doctors and coaches are the same people in my mind. Patients and athletes, they're just different protoplasm. They got slightly different problems, but the essence of what's going on is the same. So there's a lot of ways to do this. The simplest way, if you got a gym, send out a little calendar. This is my insurance agent. I get one every year. I throw it away. But if you say to somebody, okay, your workout is you got to do 30 minutes, you got to break a sweat, but you got to be able to keep talking the whole way. If you do that, put a dot there. If you didn't do it, don't put a dot. At the end of the month, I want to see you for a follow-up 5-minute consultation. And I say, you missed 12 days in the month. What's wrong? Why can't you do this? Remember, ACSM is 30 minutes moderate intensity 5 days a week, which is 21 days in a month. So, and then you can plot this in the simplest graphic. Ask the patient to write it down and say, okay, how many days per week did you do over each month? And you get a graph that you can look at and you say, 21 days, this time they're doing really good. This time and this time they're not. These are months of the year. Why are you not doing it? Well, if you live in Wisconsin, you know it's miserable outside. So now you've got to focus to say, okay, I need to help you find a way to exercise in the winter. Because in the summer, you follow the advice good. Training monitoring, you can make a decision in 2 minutes. You can counsel somebody in 2 minutes. And then, I'm sorry, a lot of these other stuff get complicated. That's the problem. We make our life too complicated. Dr. Cato did us a wonderful job. He was the one that developed the first really usable heart rate, or step counter. Where he came up with 10,000 meters a minute, I'm not sure. I think it's the same place that Run to 180 and Recover to 120 came out of. It's not a bad number. It's just not based on anything. But you know, and athletes do a lot. We know the more you do, the better you get. So that's good. So 10,000 steps a day, 70,000 steps a week. Have them write it down. Give them a piece of graph paper if they don't know how to use Excel. And then when you see them, you say, okay, I wanted 70,000 steps a week. You built up to it. You're above it. What the heck happened here? Well, I went on vacation. Okay. And then they went back up and stayed. So you pat them on the back. You give them a t-shirt. You give them some of their money back. You monitor exercise and you've given the patient the feedback. My suspicion is, and there's a lot of data, the REM data, and some of Rainer Hambrick's data, suggests that somewhere around 85 to 90,000 steps a week is probably most optimal, but you can pick any number you want. It's a matter of getting people to write stuff down. We know sedentary people do, Carl doesn't push the button, right button. Sedentary people do about 5,000. ACSM says 10,000. We know the Amish farmers that David Bassett studied, who hardly get contemporary diseases, they're up around 15,000 steps. So if you're going to do 5,000 anyway, to get to 10,000, you probably got to do 45 minutes of structured exercise. So now we've got a guideline for people to follow. Then you can follow people, say, okay, I want you to do stuff, and let's use minutes, just to, as a nice example or whatever, so I can plot over the space of 12 weeks of, say, a cardiac rehab program, the number of minutes per week goes up and reaches a peak. You slowly go faster and faster and faster, so your METs go up, your minutes go up. I have a target for you that's about 12,000 steps a day. You can pick the METs out of any table. The ACSM compendium is the best one, but go to the back of any exercise physiology textbook, and you got METs. It takes you 2 minutes to do this kind of stuff. It's maybe a little harder for people to do it on their own, but it's doable. The session RPE, which we came up with, you can do the same thing. Sunday I went out for an hour. It was a 5, which is hard. I multiply those together, I get a certain number of points, trips, if you will. And so each day I have a different goal or whatever. At the end of the week, I did this much total exercise. Then you just got to decide, the therapist or the coach, how much do I want you to be doing. You can calculate a monotony score. Usually if it's below 2, everybody does well. If you're training hard and get above 2, you're not going to do well. I multiply these together and I get the bad stuff. I can draw a picture which looks like a periodization picture. This is a micro periodization. I'm in 1 week. So I've got hard days and I got easy days.